ahead collapsed in a cloud of dust and splintered timber cutting off their exit. The air. I grew up hearing my uncle's voice echo down the hallway when he told his stories. He wasn't the sort of man to embellish much. A miner most of his life, he spoke with the bluntness of someone who had seen the earth at its worst. He used to say, "The mountain doesn't hate you, it just doesn't care whether you come back out." It was the spring of 1961, early in the thaw season, when underground water seeped into the walls and made the clay heavy. My uncle Tom Garrison was the shift supervisor at a coal mine carved into the side of a ridge not far from the river flats. The men who worked there trusted Tom because he knew the mine's moods. He could read the way the timbers creaked and the way the dust fell when the roof was feeling heavy. That spring, he'd been warning the company to brace the older galleries, but the bosses were more interested in getting the last of the winter coal out before the rains came. On a Friday evening in April, Tom's crew was on the late shift. Most of them were young men in their 20s with faces already darkened by years of coal dust. The air outside was damp and cold, but inside the tunnels it was warmer, thick with the smell of wet clay and the hum of the ventilation fans. Tom walked the main gallery with his carbide lamp hissing a pale blue flame. He tapped a few of the roof props with the handle of his pickaxe, listening to the sound. Hollow, too hollow. A few minutes past 9 o'clock, the mountain gave its first warning. A muffled thud rolled through the tunnels, rattling lanterns on their hooks. Dust sifted down from the beams. "Hold your spots," Tom called. His voice carried steady but sharp. "Don't run. Just listen." The men froze where they were, hands tight on their picks and shovels. The noise stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving only the echo of dripping water and the pulse of the fans. Tom moved toward the east gallery to check the supports, motioning for two of his crew to follow. They found one beam leaning out of true, its base sunk into the softened clay. He told the men to fetch a wedge and brace it. By 9:30, they'd barely finished when the ground gave a low groan, followed by a crack that rolled through the tunnel like distant thunder. "Everyone out now," Tom ordered. The crew began to retreat toward the main shaft, but before they could reach it, a roar like a freight train filled the tunnel. The ceiling ahead collapsed in a cloud of dust and splintered timber cutting off their exit. The air turned gritty and dim as the lamps flickered. The men coughed into their sleeves, eyes stinging from dust. Tom swung his lantern in an arc, counting heads through the haze. 12 men trapped with him. Behind them, a side tunnel led deeper into the mine, toward the ventilation shaft. Narrow, crooked, but still open. Tom knew the shaft might be their only chance. He told the men to stay close and keep their voices down to hear any shifting in the roof. They moved carefully, boots squelching in the damp clay. When they reached the junction that led toward the shaft, Tom knelt to test the air. The draft was still moving, cool against his palm, which meant the shaft wasn't blocked. That cold breath of air was the first good sign of the night. But he also knew the second collapse often comes after the first when the earth settles. He didn't say it out loud, but he felt the minutes sliding away as he told the men to rest against the wall and wait for his word. The silence of that tunnel was heavier than the mountain above them. Tom always carried a length of braided hemp rope coiled at his belt. Old habit, he said, because a rope in a mine was as useful as a second pair of hands. That night, it proved to be more than that. The ventilation shaft was barely wider than a barrel, sloping upward in a crooked line to an emergency grate near the surface. If it stayed clear, it could be a lifeline. But the tunnel leading to it narrowed so much that a man could only crawl on his elbows. Tom knew the shaft's bends and the hollow between the beams from years of crawling in to check the air vents. He knelt at the tunnel mouth and pulled the rope free from his belt. The coil smelled faintly of coal dust and machine oil. "Listen up," he said to the men clustered behind him. His voice carried firm but low in the dusty gloom. "We'll use the rope as a guide. I'll crawl first and tie it to the grate. We move slow, one at a time. Nobody lets go of the rope, no matter what you hear." The younger miners nodded, their eyes reflecting the dim blue of the carbide lamps. They were tough lads, but fear had a way of hollowing the bravest faces. Tom slung the rope over his shoulder and set his lamp low to avoid blinding himself in the tight crawl space. The first few yards were damp but stable, the walls pressed with wooden cribbing that held firm. The draft of cold air brushed his cheek. steady and clean. About halfway through the crawl, the tunnel pinched so tightly that his shoulders scraped the sides. The rope dragged across the gravel floor, whispering with every pull forward. Behind him, he heard one of the men start to cough. The dust made every breath feel like swallowing grit. "Keep breathing slow," Tom called back without turning. "We're almost to the vent." When he finally reached the base of the ventilation shaft, he found it narrower than he remembered. The spring rains had washed silt into the corners, narrowing the opening to little more than a chute. Above, he saw the faint shimmer of moonlight through the iron grate. Still open, still breathing. Relief was a bitter taste at the back of his throat. He looped the rope twice around the lower beam and tied a square knot tight enough to hold a horse. Then he tested it with his weight until it bit deep into the wood. "Rope's fixed," he shouted back. "Follow the rope hand over hand, don't rush it." The first man to crawl forward was young Billy Turner, barely 22. His face blackened except for the pale rings around his eyes. He gripped the rope like it was the last solid thing in the world and dragged himself forward. Tom guided him up to the shaft's edge and told him to climb steadily, keeping his boots braced against the sides. One by one, the others followed, each using the rope to feel their way past the tight spots. While the men moved, the mountain groaned again, a low tremor that shook loose a thin cascade of dust from the roof. Tom pressed a hand to the wall and waited, heart hammering, until the sound faded. By the time the eighth man reached the shaft, the air had grown thicker, as if the mine itself was holding its breath. "Move faster," Tom urged quietly. "We're running out of time." The last of the crew made it to the shaft without a word, their faces streaked with sweat and coal dust, their hands raw from the rope's coarse fibers. Tom was the last to follow. Before climbing, he gave one last look back at the dark tunnel they had left behind. The lamp flames fluttered as if waving him on. Then he hauled himself up the rope, praying that the mountain would stay still long enough for them to reach the moonlit grate above. Half the men had already climbed up into the night air when the mine gave its second warning. Tom was still braced in the shaft, helping another miner wedge his boot against a beam for leverage, when the ground below them shuddered like the pulse of something deep in the earth. "Keep moving," Tom barked, voice echoing harshly in the narrow chute. Above, the lantern light from the grate wobbled as the men already out top scrambled to haul up the next climber. The rope creaked under their combined weight, dust sifting down like dry snow. Then came the sound that every miner dreads. The low crack of timber splintering, followed by a hollow boom as part of the abandoned gallery behind them gave way. The tunnel they had crawled through a few minutes earlier was now filling with dirt and broken beams. A gust of stale air surged through the shaft, as if the mine had sighed in pain. Tom clenched his teeth and shoved the man above him upward. "Go! Don't stop for anything!" The shaft shuddered again, loosing a few fist-sized clods of clay that thudded against Tom's helmet. He ignored them and glanced down. The last two men still at the bottom were staring up at him, eyes wide with fear. "You first," Tom called to the older of the two. "Follow the rope. Use your legs, not just your arms." The man nodded and began to climb, boots scraping against the damp wooden braces as his hands worked up the rope's rough hemp. As he moved, the mountain's groans deepened into a rumble like distant thunder rolling closer. Tom looked at the youngest miner, Eddie Mills, barely 19, his face gray beneath the coal dust. "You next. Stick to the rope. Keep your head down." Eddie swallowed hard and nodded. He started climbing, his boots slipping at first but then finding a rhythm. Tom waited until Eddie's boots disappeared above him before he finally set his own hands to the rope. His shoulders ached from the hours underground, and the weight of the mountain seemed to press harder with each pull upward. Halfway up, another tremor shook the shaft. The rope twanged against the side as pebbles rattled past him. For a moment he thought the shaft might close like a clenched fist. Above him the men shouted encouragement, their voices muffled by the roar of shifting earth. Tom hauled himself up another few feet, his fingers burning against the coarse fibers. When he finally felt a pair of hands reach down and grab his wrist, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The last push was the hardest, crawling up past the grate where moonlight spilled silver over their blackened faces. As Tom rolled out onto the wet ground, a final rumble from below told him the shaft behind them had given way. They had made it out in the nick of time. For a moment, the men lay sprawled on the cold spring grass, coughing up dust and mud. The stars above looked impossibly bright after the hours of lamplit darkness. Tom sat up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and turned to count the crew. All 12 men were there, dirty, shaken but alive. The foreman from the surface crew came running with blankets and a flask of water, his face pale as he saw the men emerging from the shaft. Tom just nodded toward the dark mouth of the mine. She's closed for the night, and maybe for good. The men didn't speak much as they huddled near the rescue lanterns. There was no cheering, only the quiet relief of men who had slipped past the jaws of the earth itself. That night, the mountain had taken the tunnels back, but it had spared the men who carried the rope. When the mountain finally went silent, the men climbed to their feet one by one. Their clothes were stiff with dried clay, their hair streaked gray with dust. The foreman led them away from the shaft toward the camp the surface crew had set up near a maintenance shed. It was only a few hundred yards away, but the walk felt like miles across the uneven ground. Tom stayed at the back of the group, watching the men limp and stumble, making sure none of them faltered. The rope still hung from his shoulder, blackened and stiff, but he refused to drop it. The night air was cold, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and pine smoke. Over the ridge, the glow of a small campfire flickered against the darkness, surrounded by the silhouettes of the waiting crew. As the men approached, the surface crew rose to meet them. Someone passed around wool blankets, and another offered canteens of water. The men drank in silence, the water tasting almost sweet after the grit of the tunnels. Near the fire, a young medic checked their hands and faces with a kerosene lamp. Scrapes, bruises, a few shallow cuts. Miraculously, nothing worse. He cleaned the wounds and handed out strips of clean cloth for bandages. One by one, the miners sank down near the fire, letting its warmth soak into their chilled bones. No one said much. Words felt too heavy after what they'd endured. Tom remained standing for a while, staring back toward the ridge where the shaft's dark opening lay hidden in the night. The mountain seemed peaceful now, as if it had settled back to sleep after its brief, violent stirring. Finally, he lowered himself onto an overturned crate near the flames. The rope rested across his knees like a coiled serpent, silent but heavy with meaning. Billy Turner, the youngest of the crew, broke the silence first. "Thought we weren't gonna make it," he said quietly, staring into the fire. Tom gave a single nod. "We were lucky, and we listened to each other. That's why we're here." Another miner asked if the company would ever reopen the tunnel. Tom just shook his head. "They'll shore up the walls or seal it off. But some places you don't push your luck twice." The men felt quiet again, their faces softening in the firelight. Shadows of exhaustion etched deep under their eyes. Around midnight, someone passed around a battered thermos of coffee. The bitter drink burned their throats but brought a spark of warmth to their chests. The foreman came over and laid a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You saved them," he said simply. Tom looked at the rope across his lap and then at the men huddled around the flames. "We saved each other," he replied. Above them, the sky was alive with stars, scattered like shards of glass across the velvet dark. After hours beneath the earth, the sight of so much open sky felt like a blessing. The fire crackled softly, its glow reflecting off the miners' tired faces. Their breathing slowed as the adrenaline faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. For a while, they all sat without speaking, the silence broken only by the pop of the logs and the distant call of a night bird over the ridge. That quiet stretch of time by the fire became the moment they all remembered most. Not the panic underground, but the peace that came after when they realized they had survived together. When the first hint of dawn brushed the ridge with pale light, the men stirred, stiff and sore but ready to leave the mountain behind for a few hours of rest. The sunrise crept over the ridge like a slow tide, spilling gold over the dark timberline. It found the miners still huddled near the dying campfire, their boots dusty, their jackets stiff from dried mud. Tom was the first to stand, his joints stiff from hours in the cold. He tossed the last ember of rope into the fire pit and stretched his sore shoulders. The men around him stirred reluctantly, the exhaustion of the night still heavy in their limbs. The foreman returned from the main road carrying a tin pot of fresh coffee, steam curling into the crisp morning air. He set it near the ashes and poured it into tin cups, passing them around with a silent nod. Tom sipped the bitter brew slowly, his eyes on the ridge where the mine's mouth yawned, dark and silent. The mountain looked calm in the daylight, almost innocent, hiding the night's violence under a quilt of dew and mist. Billy Turner sat nearby, still wrapped in a wool blanket. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. "Feels strange," he murmured, "like none of it happened, but I can still hear it. The roof cracking." Tom lowered his cup and nodded. "That sound stays with you. Teaches you respect for the earth you dig into." One of the older miners rubbed his bandaged hand and said they should all head home before the company men arrived with their questions and paperwork. Tom agreed, though he knew they'd have to give their statements sooner or later. The surface crew began gathering the tools scattered around the site, folding blankets and stamping out the last of the coals. The ground was still damp from the night dew, the scent of pine and smoke lingering in the air. Before leaving, Tom walked alone back to the ventilation shaft. He crouched near the dark opening and rested a hand on the rim, feeling the cool breath of air rising gently from the depths. It smelled of wet clay and coal dust, the scent of a place that had nearly claimed them. "Thank you for letting us out," he said softly, as if the mountain could hear. Back at the campfire, the others were ready to leave. They started the walk down the slope toward the dirt road where their trucks were parked. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and warming their backs as they trudged downhill. The road passed along the riverbank, swollen from spring runoff. The water was loud against the stones, a reminder of the same rains that had loosened the clay inside the mine. When they reached the trucks, the men loaded their tools, in silence. Tom lingered a moment, watching the river before climbing into the cab. The world outside the mine felt sharper, cleaner, as though every breath carried a new weight of gratitude. At the small town clinic, the crew was checked for injuries. The nurse scolded them gently for ignoring the first warnings of the cave-in. Billy Turner grinned weakly at her concern, promising to rest his bruised shoulder. By afternoon, most of the men had gone home to their families. Tom stayed behind to file a brief report for the company, his handwriting slow and deliberate as he described the first tremor, the collapse, and the rope that led them out. When asked if he wanted the shaft sealed immediately, Tom only wrote, "Close it until further inspection. Don't send men in until it's safe." That night, he sat on his porch with a chipped enamel mug of coffee. The sky above the valley was streaked in orange and violet, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. 2 days after the rescue, Tom was called to the mining company's office in town. The building was a narrow brick structure with a green tin roof that rattled whenever a wagon passed. Inside, the walls smelled of paper dust and coal smoke, and a single ceiling fan clicked as it turned. Tom arrived in his work clothes, his boots polished but still stained dark around the seams. He sat quietly in the reception chair, his hat in his lap, while the clerk at the front desk shuffled papers without looking up. When the manager finally called him in, Tom stood with the same calm dignity he'd shown in the shaft. The manager's office was cramped, lined with ledgers and maps of the mining sites pinned to the walls. A brass clock ticked steadily on the shelf. The manager, a man named Caldwell, offered Tom a seat but didn't bother with small talk. "I need your account of what happened Friday night," he said, sliding a blank report sheet across the desk. Tom took his time, recounting the first tremor, the sound of splintering timber, and the crew's escape through the ventilation shaft. He explained how the rope was used as a guide and how they managed to keep all 12 men alive. Caldwell listened, tapping the end of his pencil against the paper. "You said you'd warned about the East Gallery props before the collapse." Tom nodded once. "More than once. They were leaning, and the clay was too wet. I told the inspector last month." The manager scribbled notes with a tight jaw. "We'll review that with the safety board." There was a pause before Caldwell asked, "What made you stay calm?" "Most men panic when they're trapped." Tom shrugged slightly. "Panic burns air. Rope and steady hands get you out." For a moment, the manager almost smiled. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms. "You know you probably saved the company a lawsuit, keeping those men alive." Tom didn't answer. He wasn't interested in the company's reputation. He was thinking of the narrow shaft and the cool draft of air that had guided them. Caldwell cleared his throat. "We'll compensate you for the rope and for your trouble that night." Tom shook his head. "I didn't do it for pay. Make sure the shaft stays closed till it's safe. That's all I want." The manager's eyes softened slightly at that. "You've got grit, Garrison. Men like you keep the crews alive." Tom left the office with the same quiet composure he'd entered with. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and sharp against the brick street. He pulled his hat on and headed for the feed store to pick up supplies before returning home. In the days that followed, word of the rescue spread through the valley. The townsfolk nodded to Tom when they saw him, a gesture of respect that didn't need words. At the general store, a mother of one of the miners clasped Tom's arm and thanked him in a trembling voice. Tom only nodded, uncomfortable with praise. Billy Turner stopped by Tom's porch one evening with a loaf of fresh bread baked by his wife. "She said it's the least we could do," Billy told him. Tom accepted it with a small smile, setting it beside his coffee mug. The rope, still stiff with dried clay, hung from a hook on Tom's porch wall. He didn't wash it or throw it away. It stayed there, a silent reminder of the night the mountain almost won. That rope, he told me later, was proof that sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about preparation and refusing to let go even when the ground shakes. For weeks after the cave-in, the rope stayed where Tom had hung it, coiled neatly on the wall beside the porch steps. It had dried stiff as driftwood, its strands crusted white where the clay had clung and then cracked in the sun. The sight of it drew the eyes of every neighbor who came by, though few asked about it aloud. Children from the street sometimes stopped at the fence, staring. One boy finally dared to ask Tom if the rope was magic. Tom only shook his head and said, "No, just a rope that knew where it had to go." The mine reopened slowly. New timbers were driven into the east gallery and a proper vent frame built where the shaft had given way. Tom refused to supervise until he saw the new bracing himself. Billy Turner returned to work a month later. He still limped from the bruising on his knee but never complained. When he first saw the rope on the porch wall, he took off his cap in a small gesture of respect. One Sunday afternoon, Tom's younger sister, my great-aunt Clara, came to visit. She noticed the rope immediately and asked why he hadn't thrown it out. Tom wiped his hands on his trousers and said, "Some tools you keep not because you'll need them again, but because they remind you why you made it home." Clara was quiet after that, just traced the rough braid of the rope with her fingers before stepping inside. Sometimes the men who had been trapped with Tom came by for coffee after their shifts. They never talked much about that night, but their eyes always drifted to the rope as if to check that it was still there, still holding its silent place in the world. One rainy evening, Billy said, "I remember when it first brushed my hand in the dark. I knew right then I wasn't dying that night." Tom didn't answer, only poured another cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "As a boy, I saw the rope often when we visited. I remember running my fingers across the clay-stiff strands, feeling as if I were touching the echo of the mountain itself." Tom once told me, "A man doesn't need a medal to remember what he's worth. Sometimes a good rope and a memory will do." That line stuck with me for years. By the end of that summer, the rope had faded to a soft gray. The hook that held it left a faint rust crescent on the wooden beam, a mark that remained even after the rope was finally moved indoors when the winters came harsh again. No plaque or monument was ever made for that night, but in the quiet town where miners and their families lived by the seasons of the earth, everyone knew what that length of rope meant. It was not about heroics in the newspapers or speeches at the courthouse. It was about the way 12 men had walked out of a mountain alive because one man chose to crawl in first. When I grew older and began to tell these stories myself, I often thought about that rope hanging in the porch light, unremarkable to a stranger but heavy with meaning to anyone who had walked the dark shaft behind it. Tom lived another 30 years after that night in the shaft, but he never went looking for recognition. Whenever a newspaper came around asking to do a feature on local heroes, he'd wave them off with a small shake of his head. "I was just doing my job," he'd say. The rope eventually found its way indoors, hung by the back door near his workbench. Every spring he brushed the dust off it as if it were any other tool, not something that had once held 12 lives together. As a child, I used to ask him why he kept it all those years. He'd answer simply, "Because I like to remember what can be done with the simplest of things if you don't panic." Tom didn't talk much about the cave-in after that first month, but when he did, it was never with drama. He described the moments plainly. The shift of the earth under his palms, the scrape of stone on his back, the way the lantern flame bent in the draft. Billy Turner came by on anniversaries of the rescue. The two men would sit on the porch, silent for long stretches, sharing a tin of coffee between them. Sometimes Billy's wife would step out with pie, and they'd both smile as if life had turned out lighter than they'd expected. In the years that followed, other miners' sons grew up hearing the story of the rope. Some of them carried spare rope in their lunch tins, saying it made them feel safer. The mine itself closed down in the late 70s, replaced by a new quarry further down the valley. The old shafts were sealed, but locals still pointed to the ridge when they told the tale of the man who crawled in when everyone else was climbing out. On the day of Tom's funeral, the rope lay coiled on a table near the front of the chapel, beside a miner's cap and a pair of boots that had been worn smooth at the toes. People who came to pay their respects would reach out and touch the rope as if it carried some of Tom's steadiness. When the service ended, the minister said something that stayed with me. It isn't always strength that saves a man. Sometimes it's the willingness to go where the ground is weakest and bring others back. Years later, I still keep a length of rope in my own truck. Not because I expect to need it, but because it reminds me that courage can be as plain and sturdy as hemp fiber in a man's hand. Whenever I pass the old mining road, overgrown now with pines and grass, I think of Tom and that night under the mountain. If you've ever had an object that carries a story of survival, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me what you keep close to remind you of what you've come through. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that bravery isn't always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it's quiet, covered in clay, and strong enough to lead the way out.